Welcome, everyone, to the fall series of Centered Life. I'm Jack Fortin, the curator and host. Our theme for this series, just as a gentle reminder for those of you who've been on and for those of you who are first-timers, the theme overall is the church's call to the public square. And what we mean by the church is not necessarily the building on the street corner, but the community of faith that makes up the church and the individuals within that community of faith, how we might address the public square. Last week, or the first week, we're on the third week. So the first week we received an orientation to this theme, and we looked at the 4 practices that have emerged out of the research that Jeremy and Christina, our presenters, have been working with congregations. The second week, we looked at 2 of those practices, accompaniment and interpretation. And this week, we're going to look at the 3rd and 4th practices, which are discernment and proclamation. And we look at them in light of what we can be doing in our communities. So I want to welcome our presenters again today, Jeremy and Christina. Thank you for being with us. We often start with a question just to kind of let people get on and get situated, as well as kind of introduce our time together. This is our 3rd week now, and we have one more. I was wondering, what was the biggest surprise or surprises that you have had in the course of doing this research? Sometimes they can be incidental surprises of people you run into, to a kind of openness or maybe a question. But I thought it'd be interesting to hear from you on what would be the biggest or one of the surprises along the way.
Want me to kick that off?
Yeah, why don't you start, Christina? Sorry, I was on mute.
Many, but one significant one that emerged in the beginning of our, I would say the first year or 2 of partnering with congregations. We had hired 8 young adults in the first year to essentially accompany 2 congregations apiece through this process, kind of walking them through the public church framework and practicing the art forms in their contexts. And as we moved to conclude that year with those young leaders and then continue to kind of navigate this process with congregations, I think the surprise for me was around my hunch of where this work will eventually have the most impact. And I think it's around the leaders that we've, we were able to bring on board some wonderful young leaders that had a pretty formative experience in leading communities and in facilitating and in this kind of posture of leadership. And so I think the impact they each will have in the maybe congregations, maybe nonprofits or schools or other places that they end up serving as leaders will have a bigger impact than probably the individual work that we did with specific congregations. But it also makes me wonder what leaders in those congregations are also finding some formative learning and experiences from this work and where they'll take that. So the emphasis on really like the importance of leadership development, I think, emerged as more prominent than what I had originally imagined our impact to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Christina. I think for me, the thing that's probably been most surprising has been the receptivity to this idea or this approach or this framework. I think across the board, from pastors to lay leaders to volunteers in congregations, when we have time like this to explain to people what we're talking about, it seems to really resonate with a lot of people as far as they know things are shifting they know the way we've been trying to do church and live public lives isn't necessarily working the way any of us want it to, and they see this framework and they say, this is absolutely what we need to be figuring out right now. And Christina and I aren't here to say that we have the answers. We don't know if we've figured this out, but we have a hunch and we have a curiosity, and this framework is that hunch and is that curiosity. And as people hear about it, they say to us, this is right on. This is what we as the church need to be figuring out right now. And so that's been a pleasant surprise that as I hear more people resonate with it, it tells me that this isn't just about personal preferences or what we think should happen as we sit back at Augsburg and wonder about the church, but that people in the church, other leaders in the church, are actually wrestling with this same question right now. You're muted, Jack.
Thank you for reminding me.
No.
Just as a quick follow-up question to the two of you, this work, the issue has been pre-pandemic. I mean, this has been an issue the church has been moving away from its potential impact. What do you think the pandemic has done? Do you think it's fostered an awakening for my lay people to realize, a lot of us won't probably be going back to church in the same way. And at the same time, we want to make a difference in the world at the time of this crisis, because crisis, I don't know, as the pandemic, what do you think its impact has been on your work?
Yeah, I think at first the pandemic caused a lot of people to kind of stop dead in their tracks and say, well, how do we move out into the public square when they're telling us all to stay home? And so a lot of our work was helping congregations imagine how the public square isn't just necessarily a physical place, but there are digital public squares also. There are ways to show up in public that worked in the pandemic as well. So I think the first reaction was just a pause, like, how do we do public work when we're all supposed to stay in private now? Now we've moved beyond that. And I think it's impacting them in other ways as well. I think mostly around change in general, and realizing that the days of the church, realizing that the days of gathering people together might be dwindling. Yeah, I think the pandemic fast forwarded that reality, right? And so pastors, church leaders right now are frantically trying to figure out, how do we gather people? How do we gather people? Because the assumption is that that's what we do. Christina and I were were interviewed on a podcast last week or the week before, talking about this model in relationship to youth ministry. And I feel like the one thing the pandemic hasn't taken away from those of us who are ministry leaders is the call to do relational ministry. And gathering people together for events has become harder. And for some reason, those of us who work in the church think that that's our primary responsibility, is to gather people together for events. But the pandemic hasn't taken away our ability to do relational ministry. And it's almost like we now have to, for decades, we've been saying ministry is primarily relational and not programmatic. We've been saying that as long as I've been in ministry. Now we have to just trust that and get back to relationships, which is where this model starts in accompaniment.
Yeah. You got anything to add there, Christina?
I was going to reference the conversation we had as well with some youth ministry folks. So I think you'd just be kind of getting an echo. The only thing I would emphasize from what we heard from them was how the pandemic essentially just accelerated trends that were already in the works.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, like we joked about, like the first step is to get the kids out the door and into the neighborhood, and the youth directors are all like, check, they're already there. So it's a good news, bad news. It's all right. Here's the reality we have, and I do feel like there's an opening right now that the level of crises that we're all still kind of reeling from and still living with is opening up space for imagination, for creativity, and if we can build ways to be in partnership around that and support one another in trying to navigate that in our different places, I think that it is also an opening for reforming the church.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much for your quick reflections. We want to now get into your presentation. I want to remind people that we have that chat section on your screen where you can ask any questions you want to. Amy is behind the scenes this week, but will be funneling your questions to me. So feel free to do that in the course of this presentation. So with no further ado, we turn it over to the two of you. Look forward to this third presentation.
Thanks, Jack. I'll do a quick review again, and then I'm going to hand it off to Christina, and she'll have you for about 20 minutes or so, and then she'll pass the baton back to me. So TJ, if you can go to the next slide, please. This is just review. This is where we keep starting. The church's call to be good news, and good news is good because it challenges and displaces the bad news. So this framework, the public church framework that we're talking about, starts there. It starts with the necessary work of taking the time to hear and understand our neighbor's bad news so that we might proclaim news that's actually good to them. And we can go to the next slide and you'll see the public church framework. These are the 4 art forms that we use. We start in accompaniment. From there, where we listen to the neighbor's story, we move into interpretation, where we think theologically about the neighbor's story in light of God's promises. We talked about those 2 art forms together last week. And then from there, we move into discernment, which is a prayerful reflection on how God's calling us to show up and be present in the current moment. And then from there, we move to proclamation, which is where we actually speak, act good news into the lives of our neighbors. And these last 2 art forms, discernment and proclamation, are the 2 that we're going to explain today. We can actually, TJ, we can just skip the next 2 slides and go to the one that says discernment, or skip the next slide and go to the one after that. Back one more. Sorry. There we go. And I'll hand it to Christina.
Thanks, Jeremy. As Jeremy said, we're gonna jump right into our exploration of the final 2 art forms that we talk about in the public church framework. So you'll hear from me on discernment, and we'll have a pause for some questions in the middle, and then Jeremy will walk us through proclamation, and again we'll have some opportunity for questions at the end. Discernment, I think in some audiences that word is a lot more mysterious. My hunch is that we've got a fairly churched group here on this call, and so discernment probably means something to you already. Maybe you've had a moment or a crossroads in life personally where you've discerned, like, God, what are you calling me to do next in this moment? Or maybe you've been a part of a faith community that's had a big question presented to you, or the calling of new leadership, or some churches that I've participated in or been a part of in the past had some big decisions about their building, about closing or selling the building or merging. So I would imagine you all have some context or some experiences you bring to this idea of discernment. And when we talk about it in relationship with this framework and how it relates to this movement, I think we'll maybe just add some more layers to how you already practice or understand this art form of discernment. There's a metaphor that we've referenced in the past. Discernment is a little bit like sifting for gold. If you've been on a family vacation or somewhere where they let you take out the little strainers and go out into the river and sift up the rocks and the gravel and kind of look through for those little nuggets of gold, those little flecks, those little bits of value. Discernment's a little bit like that. And if we can move on to the next slide, I'll offer a bit more in terms of what I mean by that. Some key things to note about discernment is that this is a community activity practice. This is done in community with one another and in community with God. So really, this is kind of a shift of listening. We've been listening in the neighborhood through accompaniment. We've been doing some wondering with one another around theological convictions in the movement of interpretation. And discernment is really maybe a more intentional shift to listen for the work of the Spirit, the voice of God's Spirit in what we've seen and what we've heard. And frankly, this is rooted in a very bold claim, faith claim, that we believe God has work for us to do, that God has a call and a purpose in our lives and for our faith communities to show up and co-create with God and participate with God in redemptive and resurrecting ways. So discernment is an intentional way to sit down and listen for that guidance and that direction and that calling to be a part of that work with God in our specific places and times. It's worth saying that discernment is different than decision making. They're not opposites for sure. They're kind of in a similar category of things, but discernment really has this more comprehensive, contemplative quality to it. It's a little bit like my son had to write a research paper on Legos last year, and he was just going to sit down and write about Legos because he loves Legos. But I said, do you know who designed them? Do you know how long they've been around? Well, he didn't know any of that, right? You have to do your research if you want to say something substantial on something. And so discernment in relationship with the work of accompaniment, of listening to neighbors and hearing their stories, the work of interpretation. This is the homework that we bring to a place of discernment then, that gives us something substantial to be able to reflect on and is important to have so that we can have clarity on the direction to go. And then the final comment here on this slide just reiterates what we've said with all of the art forms, that this is both outreach and discipleship. It's outreach in the sense that, if you think about this movement as a whole, accompaniment is moving into the neighborhood and into relationship there. Interpretation is coming back in together in Christian community, wondering about those core theological convictions and starting to put them in conversation with the stories. Discernment maintains this kind of community reflection time of really trying to get at what is God's presence inviting us to do or be in this situation and in this moment, so that we have some direction and some clarity and some particularities about how to re-enter then the neighborhood in relationship in ways that are life-giving. So it's outreach in that sense. And it's discipleship in that as we practice this as Christian community together, we are equipping ourselves and our folks to be able to lean into this kind of posture in their own lives as they encounter crossroads or important kind of mile markers in their own lives. The next slide, please. So the next slide here has a couple questions on it that we bring to discernment. And before I say something about those questions, I want to just add this little layer. We've been doing some evaluation work with our first group of churches that were part of the Riverside Innovation Hub. And hearing kind of them reflect on how they practice these different art forms and where their challenges were and where they found, breakthroughs and those sorts of things. And a theme that has come up is some naming that the move from interpretation to discernment doesn't feel real obvious. They feel kind of similar. They feel like they're related, is what we've been hearing from some of the congregational partners. Like, when do you stop interpreting and now you're in discernment? Because it seems like it just kind of flows, which I think it does. I think if you were going to pinpoint, like, and now we're intentionally in a posture of discernment, it would be these kinds of questions. It would be having, like, you've got all the gravel and the bits in your bowl now, and you've been kind of playing with them, and now you're going to start kind of sifting through. And the convening question for discernment is some form of, given what we've seen and heard in our accompaniment, in our interpretation work, who is God calling us to be, and what is God calling us to do in relationship with our neighbor? So that question, posing that question and gathering your folks around that question is the pivot, really, I think, into discernment as we think about it in relationship with the public church framework. Another way to ask that question would be to kind of employ that good news, bad news dynamic that we've talked about. So what is the good news that needs to be proclaimed in word or in deed? Would be another way to really shift attention into a posture of discernment. We can jump to the next slide here. So how would you go about practicing discernment with your folks? Again, these are art forms. You already have all likely engaged in discernment in a variety of ways. You would bring some of your own particular practices or rhythms, or maybe you have liturgies or certain prayers that have been a part of your experiences with this. I think there are at least 4 kind of key ingredients to a discernment space, and they might take shape in a lot of different ways. The first little picture you see there shows some folks gathering in a circle in a room. This is actually a group of some of our congregational members from these last couple years. You need intentional space. A discernment conversation is like a designated time with a designated place where you're inviting specific folks that have been a part of this experience with you to come together and pose this big question. Given what we've seen and heard, who is God calling us to be, and what is God calling us to do in relationship with the neighborhood? And you need an intentional space to do that. Now, that might mean you want to be in you're not going to go to the local coffee shop because there'll be too many distractions and too much noise. You want to have some more less disruption kind of space. Or maybe that coffee shop has really risen to your curiosity level because of the interpretation or the accompaniment work you did. Maybe that would be a great place to do discernment because it's related to the place that you're wondering about God's call for you and for your people. So it could be anything as long as it's intentional. The second ingredient, that's a picture of my daughter at a Christmas worship service with a candle and the Bible, just to say some way to invite the Holy Spirit into this space. You've created this specific time in a specific place with specific people to wade into this discernment, wondering, and we also need to intentionally invite the Holy Spirit into that space and into our conversation. So whether that's a written prayer, an open prayer, lighting candles, time for silence and some breathing, reading scripture, some way to intentionally invite the Holy Spirit to be present in and with you in this. The third key ingredient, this is the research bucket. This is our stories from the neighborhood and the convictions that we hold to be true about who God is and who God calls us to be. The picture here you might recognize from last week is some colored Post-it notes with arrows and dotted lines from one of our congregations. This is representative of the stories they heard and some of the theological convictions they had and some of the connections that they were making and patterns they were seeing. You want to bring all of that into your discernment space, right? And then finally, really good questions. The questions that I named on the best questions slide about, given what we've seen and heard, who is God calling us to be and what is God calling us to do? That's your big convening question that you're gathering around. but the specifics of your place, of the people you talk to, of the things you're wondering about are going to shape, are going to bring other questions into that space as you try to sift through all of the different nuggets and pieces to find those bits of value, those bits that give you some direction or some hint at the next thing God is calling you into. So questions that nurture open-mindedness, humility, patience, imagination, and ways to tend to the senses, the five senses of our body. And I'm going to share here a story. If you can move to the next slide, TJ. A story that will illustrate that a little bit. So the discernment story I want to share with you all is from University Lutheran Church of Hope. They are a church in Minneapolis, in Dinkytown. And if you're not from or familiar with the Twin Cities area, Dinkytown is kind of the hub of the University of Minnesota. They sprawl into many neighborhoods, but Dinkytown is kind of their center. Lots of quirky, kind of old community, local businesses, lots of different types of housing, much of it far too overpriced, and even more so as this is a community experiencing lots and lots of gentrification, and the pandemic just kind of doubled down on some of the smaller local businesses there. So just a very transient population. The average length of stay for folks in that neighborhood for renters is 9 months. So imagine doing ministry in this context. So this is Hope's neighborhood. And they did the work of accompanying their neighbor and listening to stories in this dynamic place. They gathered together and did some thoughtful reflection on core theological convictions and some language that really resonated for them about that. And then they set up time to do this discernment work together. And we got some reflection notes from their coach and from the team about how this went for them. You know, on the surface, they talked about this meeting like it looked like it went really well. They talked about the things they were supposed to talk about. They had time for prayer. They brought ideas about God's story, God's promises, and their neighbor's story, and who they were as a congregation into the room. And then they came up with an idea, and the meeting ended, and everyone went away. And then one by one, folks started reaching out to the coach and saying, you know, that the energy was so low at that meeting. I don't feel a lot of excitement about what we came up with. And one by one, they were all independently recognizing that they just didn't feel energized. Something didn't feel right about that conversation. And so they regrouped and came back together. And really the conclusion they came to was we made plans and made a decision, but we didn't really do discernment. And so they kind of re-entered this, reposed this question, given what we've seen and heard, who is God calling us to be? And what is God calling us to do in relationship with our neighborhood? And I'm just going to read a quote from the reflections from one of their team members that I think finally lifts up that nugget that they were sifting for. She says, I think we felt a certain pressure to produce something in the first meeting. So we were pushing ourselves to come up with a really tangible product. And I don't think we felt like we had the freedom to say that we actually had more listening to do. And so the discernment, the direction was, we need to do more listening. We need to involve more folks in this accompaniment work and re-enter the neighborhood in the posture of listening. And there were a lot of things that were preventing them from kind of naming that as what God was indeed calling them to do next. But because they paid attention, because they were humble about it and willing to kind of slow down and say, hey, maybe we need to rethink this or we need to revisit this, they were able to move into this direction and move back out into the neighborhood to continue listening in some more intentional ways. So with that, I'll stop sharing. And if there's any questions or comments, we can take a few minutes for that before we move on to proclamation.
Thanks, Christina. I don't see any questions right away. So Amy has said there aren't any immediate questions. So why don't we proceed and let people continue to brood on your presentation as we move into Jeremy's.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I just threw something in the chat. As I was listening to Christina, I was just reminded of how this whole process that we're talking about really could be thought of as a model for discernment. The practice of discerning ministry and next steps became really important to me. I think I was a youth minister, and I was starting I had just taken a new call to a church in Valparaiso, Indiana, and walking in brand new, and I didn't know the community really at all. And I felt like I had a choice. I could sit in my office and try and come up with a ministry model for that congregation and hopefully get it right, or I could do that work with the community itself and invite the young people who I was called to be in ministry with into that process, and invite the adult volunteers that were willing to spend time with those young people into the process also. And so our whole ministry essentially became about discerning how do we collectively as a community gather together on a weekly basis and wonder together how God's calling us to live out, to live in this freedom, and how are we being invited to live into this good news collectively as a community and individually. And so our ministry practice there was really about discerning God's Spirit and discerning the invitation. And as I was just sitting here listening to Christina, I was being reminded of that this public church framework is really a way of discerning God's call in our lives. It's really about discerning vocation, essentially. So that was just a little tidbit I wanted to add. I don't know if any questions have popped up since then. We love questions, so if you have any, please share. And we also love pushback. So if you want to challenge this model, we're always open to that.
No questions at this time, so I think
we'll keep going. We'll keep going. TJ, if you can click on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about proclamation. Lutherans love to start in proclamation, and Luther loved to start in proclamation, and would talk quite frequently about how that was where it all began. You speak the good news lands in the hearer's ear, and the Spirit takes it into the soul and transforms the person. And I'm not at all opposed to proclamation, but I believe deeply that there's a lot of work that needs to be done before proclamation. If we want to proclaim good news, we have to listen to bad news. We have to take the time to allow the neighbor to tell us in the neighbor's own words, how they're actually experiencing bad news. And then we have to take the time to wonder theologically about what that might mean for us. And we have to take the time to wonder prayerfully together how God's inviting us to show up in that space at that time. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen before proclamation, but all of this work is pointing towards proclamation, and that's where we move right now. So proclamation, these 6 points quickly define what we mean by proclamation. It's that movement back out into our neighborhood with a message of good news. That news is good because it'll give hope in the midst of bad news. It's not just the proclaimed word, the spoken word, but it's also deed. It's sometimes the things we do, not just the words we say. It can be prophetic and it can be pastoral. By that, what we mean is that it can be a challenging word or a challenging action that points out to the community where we've lost track of God's desires for us. It could be a challenge to the community to go back to God's promises, and it could be pastoral. It could be a moment where we are speaking mercy and grace and forgiveness and reconciliation. I think public proclamation can be both pastoral and prophetic. It brings newness. So when we proclaim good news in our neighborhoods, sometimes we're bringing something new that isn't already there, and at other times we're simply pointing out what's already there. I think of a community garden, and I think I talked about this last week too. It's just an easy example, and a tangible example, a physical example of resurrection. A neighborhood that has a vacant lot that has become a sore spot in the neighborhood gets transformed and converted into a community garden. Maybe the church was a part of that, maybe not. But the church can surely become part of that community garden as an act of resurrection, as a proclamation of resurrection in that community. So sometimes we bring newness, and sometimes we're pointing out where the Holy Spirit is bringing newness already. And then lastly, as we've been saying, this is both outreach and discipleship. It's a movement out into the community to proclaim good news to the community. But in the act of doing that, the people in our congregations who we're doing that with learn how to do that same thing in their own personal lives. They're learning how to do that if we do it as a church with the neighborhood our church is in, then the members of our congregations learn how to do that with their next door neighbors, with the people they work with the people they volunteer with their own children, with their own grandchildren, with their own friends. So it's always outreach and discipleship in this model. The image behind this screen is a stack of stones. And I use this image because of a little story in the beginning of Joshua, which I really like. So the Israelites have spent 40 years in the wilderness. They're ready to cross the Jordan River and enter into the promised land. Moses has died, doesn't enter into the promised land with them. So Joshua is now asked to be their leader. And God tells Joshua to ask one member from each tribe, each of the 12 tribes, to pick a stone out of the river as they cross the Jordan River into the promised land. Have one member from each of the 12 tribes pull a stone out of the river. And when you get to the other side of the river, pile the stones up on the banks of the river. And he says, so that when the children play down by the river, they're going to ask you, what's with the stones? And when the children ask you, why are these stones stacked here? Then you're going to have to tell them the story about how God set you free and brought you through the wilderness into the promised land. And that, I think, is a beautiful example of what we mean by public proclamation. A pile of rocks that forces you to tell the story of how faithful God is. And so our challenge to churches to think about public proclamation is a challenge to think about how are we being called and invited to mark place and mark time in our physical space as a way of reminding people of God's faithfulness. And sometimes it's a pile of rocks, and you put it there. The only reason you put it there is so that the kids will ask you why it's there. And once the kids ask you why it's there, then you have to tell the story about God's promises. And that's the point of some of our public proclamation, is to get to tell the story again about a faithful God. TJ, if we can go to the next slide, I want to share with you also the best questions that we have for public proclamation. Again, how you do proclamation is going to look different in your context based on your neighbor's bad news, based on your community's assets and liabilities. So it's hard for us to tell you how to practice proclamation. What we can tell you is what we mean by proclamation, and then we can tell you some questions we think you should be able to answer on your way towards proclamation. But these 4 questions we think will help you get there. again, now you've moved through accompaniment, you've moved through interpretation, you moved through discernment, and now you wonder as a community, what will we say and do? What are we going to say and do to proclaim this good news? We've discerned what we think the good news is for our neighbor. We think we know, we think we now know what it is we want to proclaim. How will you proclaim it? Will you show up with a gift basket? Will there be some public art installation on your church property? Are you going to bulldoze the parking lot and put in a community garden? How are you, what are you going to actually do now to make the proclamation? Second question, when, where, and how will we say it and do it? Like, actually get specific. I will often say, oh, I need to do that. I need to remember to do this thing. But if I don't pause and say, when am I going to do that thing? Where am I going to do that thing? How am I going to do that thing? And how will I know it's done? If I don't do those steps, then that thing just dangles out there forever and I never get to it. So if I actually want to accomplish it, I have to think about when, where, and how will I actually do that thing. So the more specific you can get, the more likely it is you'll follow through with these actions. Number 3, how will it either engage despair or celebrate the presence of hope? Again, this is where I said sometimes we come in with newness. We might show up with something new that engages our neighbor's despair and proclaims good news, or we might just come in and celebrate the presence of hope. We might come in, we might ask the community if we can show up as a church and pray a blessing at the neighborhood garden that the neighborhood created without the church. They might have done that already. We might see it as a sign of hope in the community, and we might want to just come and pray a blessing over it. And then lastly, how will our neighbor be involved with us in this proclamation? Again, we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about accompaniment. How do we keep this from becoming transactional, where we show up as the ones who have what the neighbor needs? That is sometimes true and oftentimes false. So how might our neighbor also be involved with us in this act of proclaiming good news in our community? So these are some of the best questions, and now I just want to give you a couple examples of how some of our churches did proclamation. And I realize as I'm looking up, I'm getting this sun through the blinds right in my face, trying to get it off my face, but I can't move out of the way. There we go. TJ, if you could go to the next slide, I want to give you a couple examples of how our churches did proclamation in some really creative ways. So one of our partner congregations is a church called New City Church. New City Church is a mission start of the United Methodist Church in South Minneapolis, and it's primarily all young adults. This church is, the mission start pastor would say, like, it's all young adults except his parents who come every week to hear him preach. It's all young adults. It's multicultural. And a large percentage of the young people who find their way to this church actually wouldn't identify as Christian. Yet the narrative of Jesus is so compelling to them that they show up on a regular basis to be a part of this community. So it's a really interesting church, multicultural, mostly young adults. And many of the young adults, as they went through the listening process, the accompaniment process, interpretation, discernment, they started to realize that many of their young adults were activists. They were either working full time as organizers in their neighborhood, or they were volunteering their time to be activists in their community, working on environmental justice issues, racial reconciliation issues, but they were putting a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into justice work, these young adults. They were doing a lot of activism work around social justice as an expression of their faith. And so New City Church started to realize that these young people were incredibly burned out and wounded and had gone through quite a bit of trauma. A lot of these, most of them being young people of color who had already, they had already experienced a lot of racism directed towards them in their own life. And now they had become activists working to dismantle racism, yet still carrying their own trauma from racist experiences in their own lives. And so New City Church created this project called the Incarnation Fund. And with some grant money they received from us and collection of donations, they were able to create a model or an opportunity and a model for these young activists who are young people of color to begin to heal. And it's centered around Sabbath rest, healing in being in nature, and working with a therapist and being in community. So they developed a model for these young people to begin to work through the healing, because they saw they didn't necessarily need to turn their congregation into activists. They already were activists. What they felt like they needed to do was help those activists heal and recover from some of the trauma they had experienced. Another example, TJ, if you could switch the slide, comes from another church that we've been partnering with over the last few years. This church is Church of All Nations. This is a Presbyterian church, and again, another multicultural church that was in our project. They're housed in, they're up in Columbia Heights, which is a northern suburb of the Twin Cities. And this image is an aerial view of their property, because Church of All Nations decided to, right out of the gate, they said, we really want to listen to the land that our church is planted on. We want to think about this land that we're on as our neighbor, because you can see the lake. There's a lake in the bottom right corner of this image. That lake had been identified by the city as pretty polluted, like a lake that had, and I don't know all the terminology. I'm a theologian, not a scientist, but the fertilizer from the neighborhood was washing into the lake. And so the levels of nitrogen or whatever it might be in that lake were really elevated. And so the city had identified this lake as problematic. And they were implementing practices in the park around the lake to convert it to permaculture so the lake could start to heal. So they were trying to remedy that and allow the lake to heal. Well, the church, you can see where that circle is on your screen, Church of All Nations, is on a hill. That grassy space between the church and the lake is a hill. It's a pretty steep hill that goes down. So the neighborhood that's on the other side of the church from the lake, everything in that neighborhood would wash down into the lake through the Church of All Nations property. And so the Church of All Nations really felt like the land was calling them to do something, to proclaim good news and hope and healing for the sake of the land. And so they did a lot of work on their property to convert their property into permaculture that would catch the runoff, the polluted runoff from the neighborhood in their property, rather than allowing it to flow down into the lake. And I just think this is a beautiful, physical, tangible, environmental example of the theology of the cross. A church converting its landscape to gather all the pollutants of its neighborhood to protect that lake below it. And so these are just two very different examples of how a couple churches in our project imagined what proclamation would look like in their location. Neither of them had set out to do this at the beginning. Church of All Nations was already playing with ideas around permaculture, but hadn't really thought about the land as a neighbor that you could listen to. They hadn't really thought about their work of permaculture as proclamation of good news, as an expression of hope and healing and resurrection. So just two examples of what proclamation might look like. I'm sure there are many others as well that you have in your own lives. But I'm going to stop there, and we'll go to our lovely question slide, and hopefully some of you might have a few questions for us or pushback, which we're always open to.
Yeah, there's several questions. There's three in particular that I want to try to get to before our end of our time. From Harold, he said that I've heard it said that reaching a point of discernment, this would go to you, Christina, possibly, is at least a call to prayer. And could you comment on the role prayer might play in that discernment process?
Well, I'm happy to comment. Jeremy may have some thoughts as well, because he was kind of fighting me to take discernment, and I won. So I love that, and what I love about your comment, Harold, I think prayer ignites our imagination for God's activity in the world and in our lives. And I think it seems like it can be easy to overlook that, like dismiss. We use a lot of God talk in the church, and we say things, like we use the words, but do we really believe them to be true? And I feel like prayer has the potential to cultivate an imagination that we're not just thinking about ourselves moving through the world as individual humans, but it expands our imagination to acknowledge the truth that the Holy Spirit is around us and within us and in others. And so that then as we move through the world with that perspective, the world is going to look much differently. And I believe that prayer practiced together and invited into intentionally can do that, can kind of break us out of our individual, like more kind of narrow maybe purview that we have if we're just left to our own devices, right? So that's my initial thought. I love that.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Jeremy?
Yeah, when I think of discernment, I think of prayer. I think of that whole movement, as a prayerful movement, as a movement of prayer, where we, take it to the Lord in prayer, where we take all the things we heard from our neighbor, all the things we're wrestling with theologically, where we take all that to the Lord in prayer collectively as a community, and we lay it before God, and we say, how do we make sense of this? Help us see what there is to see here. I see that whole movement as prayer, as a prayerful movement that we do collectively as a community, allowing ourselves to be open to the Spirit's movement in that space.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Mark Sender, I don't know what its story is. He says, tell us a story of what happened at Valparaiso. Is there something that happened at Valpo that...
Well, maybe he's, I can tell you a nice little story I like to share about how discernment shaped our ministry. Maybe that's what he's asking. I wouldn't have a year-long plan for our ministry. Our leadership team would gather monthly in these prayerful spaces to essentially ask ourselves, how do we sense God moving in our community? What do we think we're being called to do next? And then we would kind of plan our ministry as a team out of that discernment. And one young woman, she was a sophomore in high school now. She's a pastor now. We can all thank God for that. When she was a high school sophomore, she said, we talk about caring for the environment all the time. We get together for these dinners every week before, youth group. And we have dinner on styrofoam plates, and we use plastic utensils, and we throw everything away at the end. We create these huge garbage bags full of trash every week. And aren't we called to be stewards of creation? You keep talking about how we're called to be stewards of creation. And she was bringing this up in our discernment time when I was asking the community to speak to how they think God's calling us to show up in the world. And I kind of blew it off. I'm like, yeah, I hear you. Wouldn't that be great if we didn't create so much trash? But there's no way we can do it because we have dinner and then we go to worship and then we go into small groups and there's not enough time. And we just have to keep using disposable stuff for the sake of time. And she just kept pushing back. And she's like, I think we can figure this out. And so she invited us into the discernment process around it, and the community listened. The leadership team listened and pondered and wondered and had a strong sense of call to actually change our practices. So what happened was we would gather for dinner, and we would use real plates and real utensils, and then we would leave everything on the tables when we would move into worship, and we would have worship, and then we'd move into small groups, and a different small group each week would do the dishes. And they would have their small group meeting in the kitchen while they were washing dishes. Worked out perfectly. And at the end of the year, when we were reflecting on our year together, every single small group leader reported that their best small group times were in the kitchen washing dishes. Those were the most fruitful small group times they had, most fruitful time they had with their small group members. It was all because this sophomore, this 10th grader, said, I think we're being called to actually make change here right now. So that's one example of how discernment impacted my ministry when I was in Valparaiso.
Thank you. I mean, you're really pointing out how community gets shaped and formed and strengthened when the community's in mission together.
Absolutely.
And it brings out people's uniqueness even more. Another really important question that I've also been ruminating on from Rod Hill. He says, your examples focus on neighborhood churches. How about those churches where the art forms are with congregations where these congregations have been formed over the last 25 to 50 years that are located by corporate decisions that focus on transportation to the site by people from a multitude of places. In other words, I'm a member of St. Andrews. It's a large church. Yeah. The church itself is way away from my community, but I can take what you're talking about and participate with a smaller group of people from my church in my community. But I think this question is really well taken. We're not all in an urban core in a community that has a geographical location to it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to take that, Christina, or do you want to go?
Oh, I'll start and you can finish.
Okay.
So some of the examples we've shared are those kinds of churches in the sense that, if I'm understanding the question correctly, that the people who would identify as members of, say, St. Luke's, which we talked about last week with the Red Door, and Hope, University Lutheran Church of Hope, which I mentioned today in Dinkytown, the majority of their members are commuters. The majority of them don't live in the neighborhood that the church is a part of. And it's a common question that we've gotten in the early stages with congregations when we're starting to develop relationships and do this work and invite them to think about accompaniment in their neighborhood. And they're kind of like, what? But I don't live here. Why would I do accompaniment here? And this goes back to how these art forms and some intentionality around these practices are both outreach and discipleship. So it's the work of the Christian community discerning the Christian community's vocation in its ecosystem, in its specific neighborhood, which is important, regardless of where the people that belong to that church come in from. And then it's also the work of doing that in Christian community that equips our folks to drive back out to their locations 20 minutes away or in a suburb or wherever, and try those practices out in their own daily lives, in the places where they work, where they go to school, the places that they grocery shop. And so, I mean, I think that the ability to show up in the world faithful to God and faithful to God's call for us to be in relationship with one another is kind of the thing. And so we're learning how to do that as a body of Christian community that has a specific location and call to that specific location. And then in doing that, we are further equipped to live this way in our daily lives.
Yeah. And I'm glad you took that, because I was hearing two angles. One was like, if I'm driving 20 minutes to get to my church, how does this impact where I live my life? And I think you took that angle. Now I want to talk about churches that are located in not located in neighborhoods, and what this looks like there. And I have, years ago when I was doing an early iteration of this, I think, and I might be mistaken, I think it was Family of Christ in Chanhassen. This is an ELCA church in Chanhassen. I think it was Family of Christ. Anyway, they were right by Paisley Park. And so when I was asking them to sort of identify their neighbor and their neighborhood, they said, our neighbor is literally Prince. They're right by Paisley Park, which is Prince's, the music artist. May he rest in peace. His studio was right there by the church. And they were in a, they weren't really in a neighborhood across the highway from them. There was a neighborhood, there was a bike path that went under the highway and hit a neighborhood. And there was a school by them, but they couldn't figure out their neighborhood. They weren't thinking about those things necessarily. So I went out with them and walked their space with them and helped them think about this as a neighborhood and help them realize that this bike path is an artery, to a neighborhood, and that this school, which was, 50 to 100 yards away from the church, is their neighbor. Another example is St. Andrew's in Eden Prairie, and I remember, and they're not in a neighbor. They're right by a strip mall. It's like a shopping center right by their church. They're not in a neighborhood, and I don't think that cuts that church off from this approach. I think it just begs the church to be creative in new ways. What does it mean to be a church that's planted right by a shopping area or by a business park? If there's medical centers around us, how might the church be present as neighbor there in that space? So it's, when we say the neighbor, we don't mean like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, a nice little neighborhood in square blocks with alleyways and picket fences. It's literally just the area around your church. And so I think we recognize the challenge, but we also challenge churches to be creative and wonder about what it means to be church actually in that very location that you're in.
Thank you. Tim Thompson says, he had a thought, he said, and I don't know exactly, he says, quote unquote, for pre-proclamation accompaniment, we could look at the many times when Jesus delays healing in order to create space for people to speak. How long has he been this way? Mark 9:21. What do you want me to do for you? Matthew 20:32. Do you want to be made well? John 5-6. Maybe just respond, either one, on his concern about letting those good questions emerge.
I think that's genius what you just said, and beautiful. I had a student in Religion 100 at Augsburg years ago who was on the Asperger's spectrum, and we were reading the Gospels, and he was livid. This young man was, as he was reading these healing narratives about Jesus healing people who weren't asking for healing, he just healed them. This young man was livid. He said, if someone took away my Asperger's, I would be so angry because this is who I am. And so I love that you're pointing, there are times in the Gospels where Jesus asks, there are times when he doesn't, but there are times when he asks. And that's a beautiful example, I think, a beautiful way of thinking about what you call pre-proclamation accompaniment. I think that's gorgeous. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, but thanks for that response, and thanks for the question, Tim. Mark Senator came back with another question. He said, how will we know when our proclamation is complete? Will we know?
Will you know? What do you think, Christina?
Well, I don't think, well, let me back up a couple steps. We've been talking about the public church framework as a way to become a public church and equip our folks to live public lives of faith. but the public church framework and even becoming a public church aren't the thing. That's not what we're after. We're actually after cultivating meaningful, life-giving relationships in the world around us. And so the public church framework gives some guideposts and some habits and some ways to kind of navigate uncertain territory as we discern how to be in relationship in meaningful ways, and in life-giving ways and in transformative ways. And so Proclamation, I don't know that this isn't like we moved through the art forms and now we've done it and now we've done the thing and now we're a public church. It's just this continual feed of that movement of proclamation back into relationship with the neighborhood, then becomes a listening post and a place to accompany the neighbor and hear more about what's going on in the lives of our neighbors, which continually is kind of moving us in this way of being in relationship. I think maybe I'll let Jeremy take the other side of this, but like in a way of like equipping folks and like moving through this, I do think, there's maybe a way to think about, all right, we tried this activity that we discerned to show up at the community garden and participate in this way. And then, moving back into some reflection on what's next, where else are we called to accompany? But like the essence though of this is really a way to be and to be in relationship. And so we're just kind of continually moving through this cycle as new seasons emerge, as new realities hit, like a pandemic, and there will be something else to challenge our communities and our places, maybe a tragic death or something in the community. That was something that I experienced the last time I worked in a congregation. We had a number of young people that died really tragically in some different accidents over the course of the year. So that was like the bad news, and we had to figure out how to enter into that in life-giving ways. And so the neighbor will let you know. If you're showing up there and paying attention, you'll know when you need to like re-enter back into more specific discernment.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, do we have time for me to respond?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Because I think this is an important question and one I wrestle with all the time. And I would say the humanist in me would say we'll know that our proclamation is complete when the bad news has been mitigated, right? So when the lake has healed and the nitrogen levels are within reason, then we know our proclamation has worked. When the children in the school that we've partnered with, when their scores start going up and their tardies going down and their absences start going down and the measures of wellness start going up, then we know that our proclamation has worked, right? So there's the humanist in Jeremy wants to be very pragmatic about this. We'll know it works when we see the effects of it. The Lutheran in Jeremy will say that we'll never know. And that's Christian freedom. That's the freedom that comes from the gospel. You'll never know if what you've done has worked, has completed it. And that never changes God's investment in me or in my neighbor. And so then all I can do on a daily basis is show up and do my best work, do the best work that I can do in that day. And at the end of the day, all I can do is trust the grace of God, trust that God holds me and God holds my neighbor. And so I have this Lutheran in me and this humanist in me, that this Lutheran that will just at the end of the day trust God and God's grace, and this humanist in me that says we have to make actual, real, pragmatic change in our neighbors' lives.
Jeremy, that was really well said. And I think at this point, a good conclusion to today's discussion. And to remind people that next week, and really we're leading very nicely in this last conversation, with the two of you is, what is our call into the public square? What can we do? And we're kind of setting that up by recognizing what Tim Thompson just sent me, saying neighborhood is not just residential. Neighborhood is wherever we find ourselves. Absolutely. And we haven't talked much about neighborhood in the workplace, but I think the workplace is another place where either I can go work solitarily and do my work and go home, or I could also see that as a place where God is deeply at work. So there's lots of different neighborhoods that we could be talking about. Well, thank you both for today's presentation, and thank all of our listeners for being a part and asking good questions. Appreciate that as well. So we look forward to next week on your call into the public square, and wish everyone a good week until we see each other again. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.